Next Monday is July the 4th, the 246th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. On today's podcast, we'll consider the meaning of that document and the meaning of our great nation.
Welcome to Exploring History with Ray Knotgrass, a production of Knotgrass History.
The government of Great Britain and its 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America had a disagreement. That disagreement became a conflict. That conflict turned into a shooting war. The first skirmishes were at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts in April of 1775. Other battles followed. In August of 1775, King George III of Great Britain declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. How were the two sides going to resolve their conflict? In June of 1776, the Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia. On June 7th, Virginia Delegate Richard Henry Lee introduced this resolution: Resolved, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Lee proposed the resolution on the instruction of the Virginia State Convention. The resolution followed years of increasingly difficult and bitter relations between the British government and the American colonies. A year had passed since the battles at Lexington and Concord. Congress debated the resolution and appointed a committee to write a Declaration of Independence. The committee included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. The committee asked Adams and Jefferson to produce a draft. Adams, from Massachusetts, believed that Jefferson, from Virginia, was a better writer and so deferred to him. Jefferson worked on the draft for several days and discussed it with members of the committee. By the way, Jefferson wrote the draft of the Declaration of Independence on a portable desk that he had invented himself. The desk is now in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Congress considered Lee's resolution for independence, debated it, and approved it on July 2, 1776. This was the big step for the colonies when they declared themselves to be separate from Great Britain. Writing to his wife Abigail, who was back in Massachusetts, John Adams captured the significance of the event. He wrote, "The second day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore." Congress then approved Jefferson's Declaration of Independence 2 days later, on July the 4th, and the delegates signed the document over a period of several weeks after that. Adams was mistaken about the exact date Americans would remember. The eloquent declaration is far more memorable than the brief resolution. But he got the significance of American independence exactly right. The way that he hoped the event would be celebrated throughout the country is how it has been celebrated ever since. And somehow Adams could see that the effect of the move for independence would eventually extend across the continent. This was an amazing insight, given that the country did not extend beyond the Appalachian Mountains at the time. The Declaration of Independence stated principles that we today take for granted, but in that day they were new and, pardon the expression, revolutionary. The Declaration described certain principles as self-evident. This meant that they were obvious to any reasonable person. It stated that all men are created equal, not that some are born to rule and some are born to be peasants with less innate worth. The Declaration states that people are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. In other words, rights from God that cannot be taken away. These rights did not come from the decision of a king or from government, but from our Creator. Merely to be alive granted human beings rights that are not to be taken away. The idea of the divine right of kings was giving way to the divine rights of people. The Declaration says that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. This means that people have the right to govern themselves. This was another revolutionary concept. The worldview of faith in God was crucial to the political philosophy that the Declaration stated. It is from the teachings of God's Scripture that the founders got the ideas of the worth of the individual, the standard of right and wrong, the rule of law, and the ultimate sovereignty of God over the affairs of men. The Declaration ended with this bold statement, and for the support of this Declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. These were not just noble-sounding phrases. The founders knew that what they were doing was committing treason against the British government. They also knew what could happen to traitors who fell into the government's hands. Nothing would discourage the American cause more, and nothing would please the British government more, than the execution of a few prominent Americans in the middle of London for being traitors. The signers were indeed risking their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. We today are so used to the American victory in the Revolutionary War that we tend to think it was inevitable, that, of course, the mighty United States won, and that this was merely another step in America's march toward greatness. But the truth is that on July 4, 1776, an American victory in the conflict was anything but inevitable. This upstart nation had a much smaller population than the mother country, and it was spread out over a much larger area. Its fighting force consisted of a small underpaid army, underfunded state militias, and practically no navy. With a barely functioning national government and no national currency, the new nation was taking on the strongest fighting force in the world, led by a government that was developing a world empire, and a government that had existed in one form or another for centuries. In fact, when the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration, the Commander-in-Chief of Continental Forces, George Washington, and his outnumbered army were grappling with a major British assault on New York City. On July the 8th, Washington received a copy of the Declaration. He had it read to his troops and to those citizens of New York who were still in the city. Despite the threat of a large British force practically in their midst, the celebration over independence began. However, the British assault on New York was ultimately successful, and the Americans there had to retreat from the city. The Americans eventually won the war, despite the many difficulties and defeats that they experienced. How did this happen? Many factors strengthened the Patriot cause. The Americans were fighting for their homeland. The British, by contrast, had to come across the Atlantic to fight, and the distance weakened their supply lines and their ability to send reinforcements. British military leadership in the war was not very effective, while the Americans fought with skill and determination. Assistance from France and from individuals from other European nations proved invaluable. Certainly a key factor, if not the main factor, was the leadership that George Washington provided. Washington did lead his army to victories, but he also experienced defeats. However, he avoided crushing defeats, and he executed clever troop maneuvers that enabled American forces to fight another day. Most of all, Washington's principles, determination, and character inspired his men to continue the fight. Here's just one illustration of Washington's character. When the war ended, Washington refused to seize the reins of political power of the new nation, even though he probably could have done so without much opposition. Instead, Washington made clear his intention simply to retire to his beloved Mount Vernon and to trust others in the new nation to create a government that would give life to the principles he had fought for. When Britain's King George III heard about Washington's decision, he remarked, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." The Declaration of Independence inspired other revolutionary causes in the decades that followed, including those in France and in several countries of South America. In fact, the American cause of freedom continues to inspire millions and to threaten tyrants around the world today. Here's just one recent example. Earlier this year, Sony Pictures released the movie Spider-Man: No Way Home. I haven't seen the movie, and this is not an endorsement of it, but the climactic battle scene takes place around the Statue of Liberty. The Communist government of China requested that the statue be removed from the movie before it could be released in China, but Sony refused. The Chinese government then requested that Sony diminish the statue's presence, but Sony again refused and decided not to release the movie in China. This decision probably cost Sony over $100 million in box office receipts. Obviously, the Communist Chinese government did not want its citizens thinking about such things as liberty and America. As it turned out, the movie grossed almost $2 billion in revenue worldwide, so Sony's principled stand didn't hurt them too much. But more importantly, it was the right thing to do. The ideas of freedom, liberty, and independence are dangerous to tyrants who want to control others. The United States is unlike any other country in the history of the world. This country has enabled greater political, personal, economic, and religious freedom and opportunity than any other country ever has. It has given people hope when they had none. This success is not just in financial terms, but in terms of their quality of life. America endured and survived a terrible civil war, which tested, as Lincoln said, whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated could long endure. This nation has seen millions of men and women fight for, and hundreds of thousands die for, the freedom for their fellow citizens to think and speak differently from how they themselves thought and spoke. Americans have also given their lives and service for people in other countries to be free. That, to me, is a mark of greatness. After Alexis de Tocqueville visited and toured the United States in 1831, he wrote, "Amongst the novel objects that attracted my attention during my stay in the United States, nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of conditions. I readily discovered the prodigious influence which this primary fact exercises on the whole course of society, by giving a certain direction to public opinion and a certain tenor to the laws, by imparting new maxims to the governing powers and peculiar habits to the governed." De Tocqueville was right. We enjoy a much greater degree of equality in the United States than did people living in Europe in the early 19th century, where there was a vast difference between the landed gentry and the urban and farming poor, and between European royalty and the serfs of Russia. In America today, even people who live on government assistance usually have air conditioning, color television, and cell phones. In America, my vote counts exactly the same as that of the wealthiest citizen. I understand that some people exercise more influence than others, and I understand that some aspects of our government and culture favor some over others. This is true with any system of government. But as America has grown and developed, not only have those born to wealthy families held positions of leadership, but children of immigrants and descendants of enslaved persons have, by their merits and hard work, held positions of leadership as well. The Declaration of Independence and the American Revolutionary Movement began a story that is still being written. It's a work in progress and likely always will be, just as we all are. Without question, large numbers of people were not included on an equal basis at the start. Women did not have the same rights as men. Enslaved persons suffered unspeakably, and after slavery ended, Black Americans did not receive equal treatment under the law for over a century. Native Americans were largely pushed out of the way, and their numbers declined significantly as a result of European settlers. Asians and Eastern Europeans also endured cruel discrimination. The story that spoke of freedom and equality was largely empty words to many people in these groups. But in the continuing story that is still being written, the thinking of American leaders and everyday Americans has broadened to accept the need for and the fairness of extending true equality to all Americans. Our best hope as a country is not to abandon the principles of our greatness and the progress we have made, but to dedicate ourselves to applying our founding principles ever more consistently. Our forefathers created an environment which created the country we know now. Over time, our worldview and our actions have caught up to their words and their ideals. Freedom provides people with the environment in which they can achieve and grow, and this means that society and culture can change and grow as well. And so, as we approach this anniversary of our nation's founding, with gratitude and pride, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. What we have in this country is a result of the grace of God, the principles expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and the ability of American citizens like you and me to change and grow. This 4th of July, pause to appreciate the great blessings we enjoy here. Commit yourself to helping further our nation toward where it needs to be. And above all, thank God for the privilege of having the United States of America as your home. I'm Ray Notgrass. Thank you for exploring history with me today, and have a happy 4th of July.
This has been Exploring History with Ray Notgrass, a production of Notgrass History. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcast app, and please leave a rating and review so that we can reach more people with our episodes. If you want to learn about new homeschool resources and opportunities from Notgrass History, you can sign up for our email newsletter at exploringhistorypodcast.com. This program was produced by me, Titus Anderson. Thanks for listening.